Well, it's a sprint element of the weekend over. Some may be breathing a sigh of relief at this point, although, of course, the after effects of the sprint are still there because the cars effectively went into Parc Fermé before qualifying yesterday, couldn't touch the cars today, and of course going into the race tomorrow it'll be the same story. So that has lingered over the 2 days. The team's unable to make any adjustments to the cars to try to get it to ride height, to any of the things that really matter. But at the other side of the coin, we did have a shootout, we did have a sprint race, and we had a good win by Sergio Perez in the Red Bull RB19. Really, really nice drive by Checo. He qualified second, out-qualified his teammate, Max Verstappen. That is the news that was the news from the shootout this morning. Charles Leclerc again took the pole. Wonderful lap, incredible clammy palm lap from Charles Leclerc. Really, really spectacular in qualifying. But in the race, it was Sergio Perez who perfectly timed it, really. I say timed it because Leclerc won the start from the clean side of the road, as he would. Then there was the inevitable safety car when Yuki Tsunoda hit the wall, damaged a wheel. And then to make matters worse, AlphaTauri then sent him out with a new right rear, but totally askew. The car crabbing sideways and costing another 2 laps from the race. Only a 17-lap race. So by the time they restarted, 6 laps had already happened, almost at half distance. Blink and you miss it. Anyway, at this point, Sergio timed it perfectly. He got into the DRS behind Charles Leclerc at the restart and just breezed past. Really, very nice pass into turn 1 and then just pulled away, managed the tyres really well. And that was what we saw yesterday in the terminal velocities, both with DRS and without DRS. It was an indication then that although the Ferrari, driven by Charles Leclerc around Baku, is a very, very quick car, when it comes to the race, when it comes to superior top speed, result of superior aero efficiency and thus the ability to manage tyres and to do all sorts of other things, then there is no peer to Red Bull. It is a peerless RB19 with which Sergio Perez won the race. I think, as I say, I think the most significant aspect of today was that Sergio out-qualified Max Verstappen for the shootout. I've talked quite a lot in the build-up to this race, both on the live stream and yesterday in the video, about how drivers like Leclerc and Verstappen, who are at the front of the grid, obviously for the Grand Prix, might approach the sprint element of the weekend, the Saturday. And I don't think they gave anything less than 100%. I don't think that has to be said from the get-go, and we saw that in the race. We'll get onto that in a minute with Max. So let's have a look at how Sergio did manage to out-qualify Max in the sprint shootout. They started on the medium tyre in both SQ1 and SQ2, sprint qualifying 1 and 2. But for SQ3, they were all on the soft tyre, so not a lot of difference from yesterday in that respect. I think the conclusion we can draw now is that Sergio perfectly paced that lap because being slower than Max by 0.07 in Sector 1 not only meant that Max was pushing the car really hard to the point where he'd overused the tyres for Sector 2, but that Perez was close enough, if he really looked after the tyres, to be able to do the lap that he did, the total lap that he did, with a lot more grip in Sector 2. He hadn't overheated the rears going into Sector 2. And I think that rather than say, oh, Max was quicker in Sector 1, I think that shows the quality of Perez's driving in Sector 1. And in reality, that is where he managed to out-qualify Max. It was by only being 0.07 slower and using the tyres much less in doing that. That was a significant point, I think, about Perez's lap. Yeah, Sector 3, Max had it slightly, but overall it was gone by then because of the margin that Perez had in Sector 2. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, the rear tyres went off on Max's car in Sector 2. You have to look at why that happened. And that happened because Perez did a much better job of massaging the tyres and not losing too much time in Sector 1. I hope that makes sense. But to me, this is another warning sign for Max Verstappen going into Monaco because Perez is incredibly good in these 90-degree corners. And I say 90-degree corners, in traction episode corners, where the corner is entirely about how well you get the power down, how you massage the tyres, manage the tyres, and get a clean exit. And that's what Perez does so well. And that really defined the result of the race, so far as the Red Bulls were concerned. Sergio was slower than Max through sectors 1 and 3, which was a surprise given that sector 1 is really tailor-made for the style of driving of Sergio Perez. Lots of 90-degree corners, lots of points where Perez can really use that incredible feel he has for traction and getting the back end perfectly in harmony with the load that is putting through with his right foot. linear, you might want to call it. He's putting down exactly the right amount of power at any given moment, nothing more, nothing less. Just that is what he does so well. And I've made this point several times, and I made it after Monaco last year. I think that's where Perez showed up Max a little bit. And I've been saying ever since then that it's going to be interesting to see whether Max has changed in any way or improved in this area, because I would say, in my opinion, it's the one slight weak point that Max still has in his driving. And what we saw this morning was that Max was actually quicker than Sergio through Sector 1 by the margin of 0.07, nearly a tenth, which is quite a lot when you've got two identical cars and they're very, very good cars. But then Sergio came into his own in Sector 2. He had much more grip, quite patently, from the rear than Max Verstappen. And Max indeed made this point after qualifying. He'd overused the rears, they were too hot, and he couldn't get anything out of them in Sector 2, which is a really demanding section where Max is going to be right on it and pushing the car as hard as he possibly can. Warm up or no warm up, correct. And in the race, as I say, which was effectively only 11 laps in the afternoon, Sergio drove really well. Let's just have a look at the difference in top speed in the DRS zone as listed by the FIA. Sergio Perez 346, Charles Leclerc 339. That's with the DRS operating, in other words, with the wing flat. So yeah, you can see a significant difference there. And all Perez had to do off the line was stay within half a second of Leclerc, which wasn't going to be very difficult, and then he just breezed past with the DRS. But a word now about Charles Leclerc and how well he drove to get that pole. He was slightly slower than Max through Sector 1, so he'd used the tyres a lot, but he was really good through Sector 2. He was between Perez and Max Verstappen in Sector 2, which shows how slow Max was in Sector 2, really. And then in Sector 3, he was actually quickest. That is the Ferrari having its tyres perfect at that moment, and Charles maximising that. Really, really good job. Bearing in mind how relatively slow the Ferrari was on the straight, 339 compared with 346, as I say. For Max Verstappen starting P3, it was exactly the race that I talked about yesterday. A difficult race to drive if you've qualified well for the Grand Prix, as Max has. He's on the front row alongside Charles Leclerc. P3 in the shootout, but he's got George Russell, who was amazingly good. As I predicted yesterday, he had the eyes on, and he was really good. In the last lap of the sprint shootout, he managed to find 2 or 3 tenths over Lewis Hamilton, and really, really good qualifying performance. So he started P4, and it was always going to be an issue, I think, between Max and George Russell. And I got to say, I'm a bit surprised that Max didn't read that. I mean, if it's Lewis Hamilton that had been alongside him, I think Max could have driven the first 2 corners the way he did. But with George Russell and George's history of what he does in that situation, I mean, what he did with Max is and Max is on the outside at turn 1, got away with it, of George. On the outside going into turn 2, which is really, really asking the guy on the inside not to make any mistakes. We've seen so many times the driver on the inside, if there are 2 cars abreast going into turn 2 at Baku, with the tyres not fully up to temperature, we've seen the guy on the inside running wide with understeer and then inevitably hitting the guy on the outside. I was surprised that Max didn't just let George Russell go, because we've seen what George can do in that situation. Go right back to Jerez, the GP3 decider, when he did that to his teammate at ART, Jack Aitken. He does that. That's the way George drives. He's a really tough, hard racer. And of course they did touch, and there was a big hole in the side of Max's car after that. And as I say, for a driver leading the World Championship with the front row of the grid tomorrow, to me, that was not the sort of thing that a Niki Lauda or a Alain Prost would have done. They would have said, right, George, go. I'm going to DRS you within a lap or 2. I'm not going to damage my car. I suppose you could say on the plus side, that just shows what a racer Max Verstappen is. Every corner, every lap, every race, whether it be a sprint or a Grand Prix, he's always going to want track position, a bit like Ayrton Senna. And so you can't criticize him for that. I'm just saying I'm surprised, I guess, that the management at Red Bull didn't drum it into him more to say, look, if you've got George there, be very, very careful. If it's Lewis or if it's Carlos Sainz, you can probably get away with it. But if it's George, and George makes a good start, there's no way he's going to back off. And you can read that. You could read that going into the race. That's the way George is. And he didn't do it. And so Max had to drive the entire race with this massive great hole on the left-hand side. I suppose the satisfying thing from Adrian Newey's point of view is that it really made the car difficult to drive. And you got to say that Max did a really good job to bring that car home third. He got within DRS range of Charles Leclerc for about a lap or 2, but then Charles was always able to pull away into the safety zone. And so Max finished third. But that will annoy Max Verstappen a lot. And now, of course, there's another situation rebrewing at Red Bull, assuming they both get Charles Leclerc relatively easily, and assuming they're running 1-2 or 2-1 tomorrow. How's it going to work out? Sergio Perez has never been more confident. He's got an unbelievable race car beneath him. And he's had a lot of people telling him recently, mainly in Mexico, I think, that he's at least as good as Max and he's got a really good chance of winning the championship this year. And then we've got, to the background of all that, we've got what happened in Brazil last year when Max didn't give position back to Sergio without really explaining it, probably because of some incident that he thinks took place at Monaco. And so what's going to happen? If Sergio Perez is leading Max Verstappen tomorrow and Max is within DRS range, but Sergio's going really well and he's driving no faster than the team wanted to drive in order to conserve fuel, conserve the tyres, can do all the things, bring the car home, not stress the car in any way. What's going to happen? Well, I suppose that's the big question mark for the race tomorrow, and that's what will make it fascinating viewing, that fight between Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen. I'll tell you what isn't going to happen. Max Verstappen isn't just going to sit there and watch Sergio Perez win the Grand Prix. Equally, I don't think Sergio Perez is going to just wave his teammate past. So, yeah, I mean, there are these DRS zones, as I say, so that does make it slightly easier. I think you could also say, Baku is a fairly classic modern street circuit. It's got these two DRS zones, but incredibly tight sections of road. And I think, the point I want to make here is that there was Max on the outside. He'd stayed on the outside through turn 1 with George inside him. And then they go into turn 2 and he's on the outside again. And George runs wide and hits him. And actually Max also brushes the guardrail. It was a sort of fairly clean brush, so it didn't really do any damage. But it was the damage from George that was the real impact. And Max was saying quite a lot about that. I can't believe he hasn't been asked to give that position back, and this isn't racing, and you don't run into people. And then afterwards, when they got out of the cars, there was a bit of a chat, and George said, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry, it wasn't my fault, and the tyres weren't up to temperature." And Max quite correctly said, "Yeah, but nobody's tyres are up to temperature. You knew you were going to have understeer going into that corner." But the real point, of course, is that recently I've been banging on about how the FIA always penalise the guy on the inside on any of these incidents. Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, Australian Grand Prix, very good example. And yet here, Max is on the outside, George is on the inside, hits him because he's got nowhere else to go and he's run wide, and there's no penalty. And I don't think there should have been a penalty, because I think you could put that under the heading of second corner, classic motor racing. But I don't think there should have been a penalty in Australia either. That's the point. And the lack of consistency is ridiculous, I think. And that was a very good example of how inconsistent the penalties are. And I think if I was Carlos Sainz watching that replay afterwards, I'd still be thinking of Melbourne, what is going on here? And it's not the only example of that. Max quite correctly probably is thinking, well, I'm on the outside here. If George hits me, for sure he's going to have to either get the position back or he's going to get penalised, one of the two, because that's what's going on in Formula One now. But it didn't happen. So, you tell me. After the safety car incident, Max was able to pull out a very clean DRS pass over George Russell and got on the radio, as he would, and said, well, when they said, "Oh, nice pass, Max," and he said, "Yeah, well, I know how to do this without running into someone," which was quite good, I guess, quite good TV. So Max finished third. George finished a very good fourth. Carlos Sainz was fifth. And Fernando Alonso, strangely uncompetitive. I mean, you could say this time last year, you'd say, wow, great result for Aston Martin. But in the context of what's been happening recently, that was a bit of a bland result for Fernando. Okay, a good recovery from yesterday when they had a lot of DRS issues, but the Aston Martin suffering because of its straight line speed, unable to do any really aggressive motor racing because they've had to take quite a lot of wing off, and he doesn't have a massive amount of grip in the core of the lap, in Sector 2 particularly, which should be where Fernando's really picking up time. And then Lewis Hamilton finished 7th, backing away, particularly at the safety car restart, from others around him, just making sure he didn't get into trouble and people hit him. The sort of thing, as I say, if it was Lewis that had been inside Max, I don't think there would have been any trouble. But because it was George, totally different situation. And Lewis has got that advantage over George tomorrow, so he would have been thinking of protecting that as well. But not a great day for Lewis, droning round. I'm not sure he would have enjoyed that race very much. So that was it. Lando Norris, who qualified 10th, continuing to improve, as I say, continuing to improve for McLaren, dialed himself out of it, or whether the team did, I don't know, by putting him on softs, and they went off after about 3 laps, so that was the end of Lando. Oscar Piastri drove pretty well. Alex Albon qualified 7th in the Williams. I did say yesterday I was a bit surprised that Williams didn't go better, but Alex did a great job in qualifying. But he dropped a couple of places at the start and finished 9th, just out of the points in this sprint format. So there we are, all things being equal, by which I mean reliability wise, Red Bull look in very, very good shape for tomorrow, as we saw with that DRS advantage that they have over the Ferrari. And Ferrari, at one point, Charles Leclerc got on the radio to say there'd been a cut, and I suspect that means some sort of misfire on the engine, but everything seemed to clear, everything was okay, so fingers crossed for Ferrari that they've got through their recent unreliability issues. But if it is that sort of day, and if Red Bull do have a clear advantage over Ferrari tomorrow, it's going to be a spectacular race, I think, between Max and Sergio Perez. At the moment, as it lies, both drivers will be thinking of a win tomorrow, and indeed Perez made that point when he crossed the line. Yeah, 1 win up, let's see if we can do this again tomorrow. And that's the way he's thinking, quite rightly so too. He drove really well. Whereas Max, by contrast, ahead of Sergio on the grid tomorrow, but nonetheless Sergio on the clean side of the road in P3. It's going to be very, very close and tight into that first corner. And also on top of that, Sector 1 is what did it ultimately for Sergio Perez. The way he was able to get through Sector 1, because he drives so well, and the sector is mainly about traction and acceleration out of corners. And that is something that if Max isn't thinking about, he needs to be thinking about going into Monaco. And to my mind, as I say, just to repeat, that is where Sergio Perez had the advantage and still has the advantage, the very, very slight advantage over Max Verstappen. So we'll see tomorrow how it pans out. Meantime, it'll be really interesting to know how Helmut Marko, Christian Horner, Adrian Newey are thinking about this, how they're going to manage their 2 guys tomorrow. Love right now to be a fly on the wall. That would be the real reality TV that we should be seeing from Formula One, discussion of how Max, Sergio and the management are going to play it in the Baku Grand Prix tomorrow. We'll see, and I'll see you then.